Hello, good evening, and welcome to India Science Festival presents Science Simplified, an initiative aimed at bringing the voice of science to your homes. With the current situation of COVID 19 around us, we've been listening to a lot of scientific terms everywhere. Often, these scientific terms become difficult to understand. The jargon that's thrown at us is often not comprehensible. And that's where ISF comes in. At India Science Festival, we truly believe that the gap between science and society needs to be bridged. And that's why we have started our talk series. And for our inaugural discussion, we have with us Professor K. Srinath Reddy. He's one of the leading epidemiologists in the world and is also the president of the Public Health Foundation of India. He was formerly the head of the cardiology department at AIIMS, and he's also the adjunct professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Professor, it's really great to have you here on our show. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Right, so without any further ado, I think I'm going to dive straight into my first question. Sir, we've been listening to a lot of science terms everywhere, and in particular, epidemiology. Could you shed some light on this word and tell our viewers what it actually means?
I know I'm glad that the word epidemiology has become very popular, at least familiar to most people.
Right.
Basically, demios means population in Greek, and epidemios actually is anything that involves the population, upon the population, or involving the population. So essentially, epidemiology has been defined as the study of dimensions, distribution, and determinants of disease in a population, and also then extended to look at how prevention and control of those diseases can be achieved. But I would like to modify it, saying it's not only the determinants of disease, but also of health. Health is a continuum from almost perfect health to disease and death. So across the continuum, you would also like to look at how healthy people are at what stages of life, and also what the determinants of health are. So that is where epidemiology comes in, essentially to look at all of these determinants.
Right. So, when we talk about an epidemic, how does a disease actually become an epidemic? What qualifies it to be called an epidemic?
Well, basically, epidemiology in an infectious disease, for example, classically deals with factors like the agent, host, and the environment. And when a particular infectious agent starts spreading fairly widely in a population, then we call it an epidemic. When it affects many countries, then we call it a pandemic. But
Right. Okay.
while this was a term that was essentially thought of in terms of infectious diseases, we now use the word epidemic also for non-infectious diseases. Like we say, coronary heart disease has become a global epidemic or a pandemic because
Okay.
it is also determined by many factors that extend across multiple populations, like tobacco, for example. So, in a sense, the word epidemic and even the relationship of agent, host, and environment has been somewhat redefined. And COVID 19 is a classical example where you have the virus as the agent, you have the
Yeah.
human being differentially affected because of host factors, like, for example, elderly people are more affected, people with pre existing disease conditions are more affected. And when we talk of the environment, we are talking about crowded conditions where the virus has easier opportunity to spread. So, all of
Right.
this is important for epidemiology to consider.
Right. Which brings me to my next question. Epidemiology and COVID 19. How exactly is the study of an epidemic helping us tackle the virus?
Well, in terms of how we are actually studying it, we know where the virus has come in from. It has come from animals and wildlife. It has spread to veterinary
Right.
populations and then into human beings. But what is the mode of spread? Is it spreading through droplets? Is it spreading
Right.
through physical contact? Is it spreading through aerosols? what are the conditions that actually promote the spread, and what are the opportunities to contain that spread. All of this can be investigated. At the same time, as I said, the host susceptibility factors, these are important. So the whole area of susceptibility, exposure, infection, recovery, what are the rates of that in each population? So that again is epidemiology in terms of studying the pattern of disease and the progression of disease.
Right. So, how would one differentiate between epidemiology and public health?
Well, basically, epidemiology is the science which asks the questions and answers them. And it
Yeah.
is integral to public health. It is at the heart of public health because it is the
Okay.
knowledge creator. Public health then utilizes that knowledge and applies it in order to address the health problems of society or of populations and says, how can we alter the conditions which have created the disease and control it fast or even prevent it for the future? So the basic application of that knowledge created by epidemiology through a variety of interventions. Public health, for example, has multiple instruments. It has
Yes.
policy instruments which act at the population level. It has system interventions which act at the health system or other systems level. It
Right.
has specific program level interventions. It has interventions also at the level of community. Communities can organize themselves to combat disease or promote health by
Right.
creating, for example, smoke-free conditions from tobacco-free environments. So public health is the area that extends the knowledge that has been created by epidemiology into action to prevent disease, promote health, and protect people.
Right. So, it's fair to say that epidemiology is a small part of the massive umbrella that public health is.
Very much so, because epidemiology creates the knowledge, public health translates the knowledge into action and carries it forward
Right.
to people protection.
Right. All right. So, now a question related to your career. How did your transition from cardiology to epidemiology occur?
Well, basically, I moved from cardiology to I moved from cardiology to epidemiology because I was quite interested at that point in time in preventing disease rather than just treating disease. And it was very clear whether I was looking at coronary heart disease or hypertension or rheumatic heart disease or any other element that I was dealing with large number of people whose disease should have been prevented in the first place. So if it is tobacco that is causing coronary heart disease, or if it is undetected and untreated high blood pressure that is causing strokes, or the inability to get penicillin for sore throat, which is causing rheumatic valvular heart disease, conditions which are eminently preventable should not be allowed to progress to disease and death. So
Right.
it is important for us to invest in public health so that we can mitigate as much of the disease as possible in the community.
Sir, like I mentioned before to our viewers, you're the president of the Public Health Foundation of India. Can you tell us an example of an initiative carried out by the organization in times of COVID-19, just for us to know what exactly the organization does?
Well, the Public Health Foundation of India has multiple institutes. It has 5 institutes across India in different parts of the country. It is located, for example, as Indian Institutes of Public Health in Delhi, in Gandhinagar, in Hyderabad, in Bhubaneswar, and in Shillong. And it also has an ancillary campus in Bangalore. Fundamentally, it brings together public health related education, research, health system support, as well as advocacy onto one platform to provide the broad continuity of multiple actions which can promote public health. It is very important for us to look at all of these as a package of interventions,
Right.
not just as an academic discipline, but as an application pathway. Therefore, we also engage with policymakers, with health system managers, and multisectorally. And very critical distinction from other forms of academic programs or even research is that because the determinants of health are multiple and act through multiple pathways, there are
Right.
not merely biological, but also social, environmental, economic, and also commercial determinants of health. You really
Right.
require multi-sectoral action to protect health from, in terms of all those determinants. So
Absolutely.
we therefore promote public health in a very broad format so that it
Right.
actually leads from knowledge to action, action to impact, and impact to equity.
Right. So, having spoken about how interdisciplinary the entire concept of public health is, could you tell us a little about how epidemiology is taught in India as compared to epidemiology taught in the West?
Well, epidemiology has been taught mostly in the West as an academic discipline, mainly focusing on teaching and research,
Right.
essentially trying to explore how best research can lead to breaking down problems into
Okay.
solutions in terms of identifying the determinants, as I said, but also researching on what the potential solutions could be. But they
Right.
never engage with policy and programs, not with health
Right.
systems. So the application pathway, actually, the academics kept away from it.
Okay.
Whereas actually you need much greater engagement, even not only to see that your knowledge that you've created is effectively translated into action,
Right.
but also to ensure that what you're doing in terms of research and training is relevant to policy and programs. So you need demand responsive research. You can't live in an ivory tower
Right.
and say that I'm not going to be bothered about the challenges being faced by the health system managers or the planners. You have to orient your work also towards that. You need to
Right.
train public health practitioners as well, who at the field level can actually implement programs. So we need to
Right.
train researchers, teachers, practitioners, and people who can actually apply public health principles at multiple levels of transformation.
Right. Okay. So, we've been hearing a lot about the term clinical trial during COVID-19. Could you shed some light on what it actually means and how it might be effective in these times?
See, epidemiology has multiple tools. You can have a so-called cross-sectional survey to find out, for example, how many people in a population sample are, for example, having high blood pressure. Or in terms
Right.
of COVID, you do what's called a serosurveillance study to find out in a cross-sectional sample of the population how many people are testing positive for antibodies against the COVID virus as a measure of
Right.
exposure to the virus. Then there are other forms of inquiry called case control study and cohort study. But the
Okay.
clinical trial is considered to be the best form of research evidence because it reduces the total amount of bias and what's called confounding, which interfere with the actual research process reaching the truth. Because quite often, these confounders, which are related both to the exposure and the outcome, or can influence the outcome independent of the exposure, can actually create a fog around the truth. Whereas
Right.
the randomized control trial can actually, by balancing the confounders between one group and the other group, between the intervention group and the control group, tries to create as much of a confounder-free environment for interpreting the truth. However, having said that, even other forms, whether it's surveys or whether it's case control studies or longitudinal cohort studies, are fairly valuable because they often offer more generalizability than a fairly narrow clinical trial. So we need to
Right.
actually adopt all of these in order to make the best assessment possible.
Right. So, speaking about this very topic, could you tell us why the testing process is taking so much time? I mean, we've also received a lot of questions in our chat box relating to the same. So, could you tell us a little about how much time the testing is taking, and if there are developments taking place to maybe make it faster in the future?
Yes, actually, you must recognize that tests are not the only way to make the diagnosis. So let's get rid of
Right.
that assumption first.
Okay.
And also, we know from epidemiology and statistical principles that most tests, including COVID 19 tests, have some false negatives and some false positives.
Right.
So, which are the circumstances in which you can actually reduce the false positives? And how can we reduce the false negatives? That depends also on the clinical symptoms and the stage of the infection. So you use your testing strategy to optimize your results, to reduce the false positives and the false negatives, right? So in the
Right.
initial stage, of course, during the lockdown, when everybody was confined at home, whether they were
Yeah.
infected persons or their contacts, and they were not really roaming around free, the testing was not as much required because the purpose of testing was isolation, and they were already isolated. But as we were coming
Absolutely.
out, we needed to ramp up the testing. And by that time, I think we had more kits also available because they were in short supply initially. So once
Right.
the eligibility criteria were expanded, more kits were available. Now the testing is being done much more. But testing is
Right.
only one part of the process. You do need to do what's called contact tracing. Try and find out who the
Right.
infected person has met before the person got infected and after the person got infected. Unless we do that, we are only isolating one infected case. We are not isolating a large number of others who could be carrying the virus. So, public health brings in all of these instruments together. Testing is important, but testing is not the only instrument that should be used for this public health protection.
Right. Okay, so I think with that, we'll take another audience question. We have a lot of questions surrounding the topic of vaccines. So, could you just shed some light on how vaccines are being developed at the moment, and if we can expect a vaccine to be seen soon in the near future, as far as India is concerned?
Well, let us recognize that production of vaccines requires firstly a laboratory component, then a series of human trials, starting from
Right.
human volunteers, ultimately with large randomized control trials. And then we can actually judge whether a vaccine is efficacious, and secondly,
Right.
whether it is safe. It could be effective, but it could have adverse consequences. So, all
Right.
of these stages will have to be gone through very carefully and meticulously. And therefore, it was basically said that it might take more than a year or even possibly up to 2 years to produce the vaccine. But a lot
Right.
of these steps are being done concurrently or being accelerated in different parts of the world because of the global
Okay.
pandemic emergency. And the WHO has said that we may see the first evidence of an effective vaccine by the end of the year. Some people in
Right.
UK are saying we might see it in terms of the initial evidence by September or October. But then it has to go into the production process. The evidence has to be
Right.
evaluated, and it has to go into production. And since the whole world is competing for it, the supply chain has to be really huge. So I
Right.
think a fairly cautious estimate would be that availability of the vaccine would be sometime in the next year, possibly, if we are lucky, in the first half of the year.
That's a great answer, sir. I'm going to move to the next question that we've been asked. It's a very interesting one, talking about the interdisciplinarity of epidemiology. We know that a lot of the science deals with statistics as well as mathematics. So the question here says, how do you think mathematical models will be helpful in epidemiology, and in particular a pandemic study in which there's been significant use of such a model?
Well, basically, we do require in epidemiology a lot of statistics. I mean, there are also qualitative research methods in epidemiology which are not so quantitative. But we do require, and as I said, epidemiology and public health are very, very multidisciplinary. They bring in quantitative sciences, life sciences, social sciences, health system sciences. They bring in all of that into one platform. But epidemiology in particular is quite actively linked to statistics. But mathematical modeling of infections and the rate of the growth of infections is based on two things. One is data, second is assumptions. You need a reasonable set of data to start modeling. Sometimes you do it from infections, for example, in this case, it's been done what happened in China, what happened in Italy, and so on. But the assumptions are also important. If you assume that what happened in China and in Italy is going to happen in India, it's wrong because the population structure is different in age. More importantly, we are two-thirds rural, one-third urban, whereas they are mostly
Right.
urban. And the virus travels much faster in an urban environment than in a rural environment. So and you have to keep updating your data from your own experience as much as possible in order to keep changing the models. Models are helpful, but they are not the gospel truth. We have to recognize
Right.
their weaknesses as well.
Right. Okay. Which brings me to my next question. It's in the interest of studying epidemiology. What background does one need to have in order to study and become an epidemiologist? And also, how does one realize interest in the field?
Well, basically, there are programs in epidemiology where people who have done their training in science in particular, or mathematics or statistics, can go into training in pure epidemiology. But anybody who has done public health, even from a social sciences background, can actually do a PhD in epidemiology. As I said, they do require some strength in quantitative sciences, but also an understanding of social sciences as well. Because really, there is no siloed science nowadays, and particularly in public health. So you can do a master's in public health and then go on to do a PhD in epidemiology, or you could do straight away a master's in epidemiology in several of the universities that offer that program. So it's usually a master's level or a PhD level program.
Great. Um, would you be able to shed some light? Like, I know that you just did speak about how different Italy or China might be as compared to India, taking the population in mind. But as far as uh, the the graph of the number of affected people is concerned, would you say that India's measures at tackling the virus are proving to be effective, or how well are we doing?
Well, right now, the situation in India is that the large cities, which actually brought in a large number of returning visitors from abroad, that means cities which had large international airports, were most affected.
Right,
Even in the east, it was Calcutta that was affected, but rest of east has been very little affected. Northeast has been
right,
very little affected. And then it's radiated from there through primary contacts and secondary contacts, and surrounding districts have been affected. Right now, I think our battle is to try and quell the epidemic in these big cities and the surrounding districts. But the greater challenge is to prevent the virus from spreading to the areas which have been very little affected so far.
right,
Much of the eastern India, smaller towns, and of course the huge rural population that we have. How well we can protect them, that is the big challenge, and we have to wait and see. So I think we did fairly well in the first two phases of the lockdown.
right.
Then there were slippages after that. And after the
Yeah,
lockdown ended, I think there was too much attention paid to the hospital component. Oh my God, do we have enough ventilators? Do we have enough beds? But the fundamentals of public health, which was very important, which was community oriented, symptom based, syndromic surveillance, house to house. Do you have fever? Do you have cough? At least on a weekly basis, somebody should inquire and then immediately get them tested, isolated, start tracing the contacts.
yeah.
Some states like Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Odisha did well in that, and they've
Right.
succeeded. Others have not done that well. Punjab did reasonably well, but others have not done that well. So that is where we must now tighten our procedures now.
Absolutely. Sir, I read an article that was written by you regarding how we can't stay in lockdown forever and how India has to learn how to move out of the lockdown phase and move ahead with lives. Could you shed some light on the same?
Look, we are now recognizing the fact that this virus is going to stay with us on this planet.
Right,
And no country is safe till every country is safe.
right,
Tomorrow, some traveler could land in India from somewhere, even if we get full control, some traveler could land in. And now, the most dangerous part of this particular virus, as opposed to the other viruses that we have seen, other coronaviruses, is that it seems to spread even in the pre symptomatic phase and even from
right,
asymptomatic people. So, given that situation, we recognize that on the street, anybody could pose a danger, or I could pose a danger to others if I don't know I'm carrying the virus. So, how long can we actually keep chasing the virus only on the basis of symptoms? It is important to isolate symptomatic people and test them,
right.
but we must get on with our economic and social activities in a very guarded manner. We cannot keep children out of school for long. We have to resume college education. We have to resume
Right.
our economic activity. But what we do need are the three C's, that is, care, caution, and confidence. Care means
Right.
I will protect myself by protecting with a mask, hand washing, physical distancing to the extent possible, and same time wearing eye protection if I can, because the virus can enter through the eyes. But caution is I will avoid very crowded places. I'll avoid particularly indoor crowds, because that is where the virus can spread very fast, because that is where the super spreader events take place. So
Right.
I will try and avoid, even in the offices, we'll try and reduce the crowding. So we will try and avoid some of these things that actually cause major outbreaks. So whether it is a social event or a religious event, and birthday parties and so on, we have to be cautious for some time. And third is confidence. Unless we actually start moving with confidence to resume some part of our social and economic life, we'll remain paralyzed in fear. So it is a mix of all of these three that we need.
I think that's a very important point that you put forth, that now there is an inherent fear in all our minds that just stepping out is going to get us affected. So the bit that you mentioned about confidence, I think that's instrumental in us moving forward. I would now like to talk about another question, that it's relating to the situation of jobs in the country, specifically with public health. So the question is India going to have a rise in the jobs after or during the pandemic in terms of public health and clinical research?
We hope so. But you see, a public health cadre of public health people with public health expertise in the health system has been recommended for a long time by multiple committees, including a committee that I chaired for the Planning Commission in 2011.
Right,
But only Tamil Nadu had a public health cadre distinctly. Then Maharashtra started reserving some positions for people with public health training. Last year, Odisha started a public health cadre. The National Health Policy of 2017 said that by 2020, at least 8 states must have public health cadre, and soon everybody must have a public health cadre. Niti Aayog
right,
announced early this year that by 2020, every state must have a public health cadre by the end of 2020. It is not going to happen that easily, but if that
right.
happens, then we will have a lot more opportunities for public health positions to be created and people to be employed. But certainly in research institutions, as well as in field-based NGOs, there'll be a lot of opportunities for employment, because the value of public health service delivery as well as knowledge creation both have been very well realized.
Okay. Um, Another question here is, with the spike in cases, why isn't there a complete lockdown being announced? Maybe a month's break again will help in controlling the situation. Your thoughts on the same?
Well, basically, the spike in cases is very much there in urban areas, but it has to be contained. Some states have gone in for an extended lockdown. West Bengal has gone in for an extended lockdown. Tamil Nadu has locked down some of the Chennai as well as some of the surrounding districts. Hyderabad is thinking of an extending a lockdown. So it all
Right.
is based on the assessment of the local situation. And if the local situation warrants it, then they will go for it. But it can't be a one size fits all situation for all of India.
Right. Absolutely. I think it depends from area to area, like you mentioned.
Yes.
Um, the next question would be, what are the precautionary measures that have to be taken to fight this pandemic in the long term on a community basis? As a community, I mean, you spoke about what we need to do personally, but what do we do as a community?
Well, let me start off by looking at where the virus came from, because all of you are science. People who think highly of science and apply science. Basically, why is it that the virus remained very quiet in the forest, in the wild animals, and became much more virulent when it entered captive bred animal population as well as the human habitat? Because we have created a conveyor belt for these viruses to enter our communities by extensive deforestation for agriculture, for urbanization, for mining. And in the last 50 years, 70% of all new outbreaks have been zoonotic, from animals to humans. Therefore, we must recognize that we must actually create a better ecological balance, better patterns of urbanization, better patterns of agriculture and livestock breeding, so that we don't create this kind of passageways for viruses to come and become much more virulent and start creating these zoonotic epidemics or pandemics. So that's the first thing that we need to do as a collective community. Second, of course, we must recognize that all measures in public health are very important. And
Right.
we and if we have to combat some of these infections, we have to firstly make sure that our innate immunity is much better. Better
Right.
food and nutrition systems, less air pollution. All of these are important in promoting our own immunity and protecting our immunity. So these are measures that we must take. And lastly, of course, whether it's a flu or whether it is any other respiratory virus, some of these habits like hand washing, cough hygiene, and if necessary, masks or some degree of physical distancing, these may have to become a pattern of life even to protect ourselves from other infections. But the most important thing is public health cannot be taken for granted. And secondly, you cannot have a health system building up a very efficient surge response if it has not been functioning well in the steady state. So invest
Right.
more in a much more robust public health system so that if an emergency arises, it can rise to the occasion.
Right. Which brings me to my next question. There are questions about education in the country and how it has come to a real standstill in times of the pandemic. I mean, everything is online at the moment, but at some point of time, like you mentioned, schools will have to reopen, universities will have to start functioning. How do you think the shift from this online to the offline situation will occur?
Well, basically, I think we recognize that some of these distance education modalities will come in anyway, and they may become part of our life because we may not be able to resume all of the classes at the same level of regularity as we did. It will be a step by step process. So,
Right.
but however, when educational institutions open, we may have to think in terms of running them in shifts rather than having the whole class crowd itself. And then
Right.
see how much of the class time can be only used for discussion on particular doubts or problem solving issues rather than in terms of having regular didactic lectures. So the pattern of training and teaching may have to change over a period of time.
Right. Another question at this point of time would be, uh, with this might be a slightly controversial one, but we have received quite a few questions on the Patanjali vaccine that has come into news. Um, do you have any comments at all based
Uh,
on?
no. First of all, Patanjali is not a vaccine. What they
Right,
said is essentially a formulation of various herbal medicines, which they said helped prevent the development of the disease in the susceptible people or brought about an early return to health in people who are affected. But then that claim they withdrew soon enough because later on there was a fair amount of criticism. Now, I have no issue with herbal potentiation of natural immunity if there is adequate proof. But
right.
demonstrating a specific antiviral effect requires much more rigorous science. And I think that was lacking in this particular case.
Okay. The next question is a very interesting one again. How do you think AI has helped in tackling the virus from the viewpoint of an epidemiologist?
See, AI is very helpful in basic science as well as in epidemiology. Basic science because it can actually create models for creation of new drugs and new vaccines by collating some of the knowledge that is there from multiple basic disciplines. But it's also useful in epidemiology by looking at patterns of spread and also the symptom complex, which are the symptoms which are much more predictive of the active viral infection, which are the symptoms and clinical signs which are much more predictive of serious adverse outcome, and which are the complexes of symptoms and signs or laboratory investigations which can actually
Right,
predict better outcomes or better response to treatment. However,
right,
we must recognize that AI, particularly in epidemiology, is based on the prior probabilities being translated into posterior probabilities, which means the context is very important. And
yeah,
therefore, you have to gather even the inputs for AI from a specific context. You can't necessarily import an AI algorithm from the West and expect it to operate invariably in the Indian situation. You have to build in your own AI algorithms. That is important in our own context. The, those who know statistics and knows the Bayes theorem know that context is absolutely essential.
right. Okay, so having talked about AI, the next question is about robotics. So, how do you think? I know that robots are being implemented in tackling the pandemic in India. Do you think they are an effective method of helping us with the current situation?
Well, robots have been going around checking temperature. Robots have been going around trying to supply medicines from a distance when the patient is infected so that the nurse doesn't have to approach the patient. There are lots of things that robots can do. But ultimately, it is the human beings who will have to direct them. I don't think you can allow the robot to act utterly independently because you have to actually make sure that your programs are appropriate. So
Right.
I do a place for robots, but I do not see doctors being nurses being replaced by robots.
Right. Okay. The next question is, do you think that the restoration of natural habitat will reduce the incidence of a deadly disease in the future?
It should. I mean, if we maintain ecological balance and start respecting nature and its interconnectivity, then we will probably be able to prevent some of the epidemics that are happening and certainly hope that pandemics can be prevented. I mean, the way we are abusing wildlife, whether for eating or through deforestation, I think that is one of the biggest risk factors that we have to contend with. And the way we actually restore nature to its balance, ecological balance, is going to be critical.
So we hear a lot about pets being abandoned during this time because they're afraid. We're all afraid that the pets might give us the infection or we might transmit to the pets. Could you tell us how exactly the transmission with animals at homes might occur?
See, it depends on where the virus finds the appropriate host. Now, it is possible that these came from the bats to the pangolins or some other intermediate host, and then to the humans, or it came directly to the humans, and these are possible routes of transmission. But right now, there is no evidence that the secondary host or the reservoir host is a dog or a cat or some other animal like that, or a cow. So I don't think it is necessary for us to stay away from all animals. It is important for us to find out which are the animals which have become the secondary hosts or the reservoir hosts, and we need to try and track that. That's why we need the discipline of, even in epidemiology, we need what's called One Health, which is looking at surveillance from wildlife to veterinary animals as well as human beings, and try and see where the viruses are getting transformed, mutated, and traveling fast, and from one species to another species, the whole spillover process. But every single animal species is not in danger. There are a few animal species into which this virus has crossed over. I don't think yet dogs and cats are among those.
Sir, I think we are coming to the end of our webinar. I'll just take a last few questions that are coming in right now. One question is, how can we modify or improve our fundamental sciences or the research being carried out in institutions to meet the demands of public health?
Well, I think research is going to be absolutely important in terms of becoming multidisciplinary. We need to make sure that we are not operating entirely in silos, because we are dealing with complex systems. And this requires answers from multiple disciplines and multiple knowledge streams. So, in our academic institutions, we must promote that kind of multidisciplinary collaborations. People ask, does multidisciplinarity mean that you're diluting excellence in one field? No,
Right.
it's not true. Actually, what we want to do in public health, which is actually a coalescence of multiple disciplines, is to produce what I call T shaped individuals. Those who
Okay.
have a depth of expertise in one area, but have a broad familiarity, understanding, and sensitivity to other disciplines. Now,
Right.
you could even have excellence in two or three areas.
Okay.
But certainly, you need the top of the T as well to have that collaborative mindset and the ability to bring in interdisciplinary partnerships. So that is
Right.
where our academic institutions must bring in all the streams of knowledge which are relevant to the problem, and then become problem solving in their quest.
Another question, and it's everywhere in the news right now: plasma therapy for the pandemic. So, is it possible to merge artificial intelligence with plasma therapy for tackling the disease?
Well, plasma therapy is essentially based on the understanding that people who have been infected are likely to have protective antibodies, which, if infused into somebody who is now currently infected, will recover faster. But we do not know whether the other component of immunity, called cell mediated immunity, whether that's more important or equally important or less important than antibodies themselves. But it is possible for us, in terms of artificial intelligence, if at all, to find out what are the kind of immunological factors that are more likely to hasten recovery, and then we can choose the nature of immunological intervention. But plasma therapy itself is basically based on the antibody levels and the assumption that the antibody levels of a recovered patient are adequate to protect the other person. But once the plasma therapy trials come out, the large trials come out, then we can see who are likely to be the responders and the non-responders, and we can feed that into the algorithm, which predicts, okay, it is useful to give this person plasma therapy at this stage, or it's not so useful to give this person plasma therapy at this stage. So those are the kind of triage decisions that can be made.
Right. At this point of time, I'd like to tell our audience members that we have to conclude our webinars shortly, but there are a lot of questions that have been asked. I'm going to compile them and send them to you, Professor Reddy, and as and when you have time, please do respond to the questions, and perhaps we can send them back to our audience members.
I do love to engage with young people, particularly those who are really in quest of knowledge and who are going to be the real change makers of society. So I'll try my best to answer the questions, but I can't promise to do so in real time very quickly because there are so many other things that I have to do. But I really enjoyed this opportunity to interact, and I hope your colleagues also found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Lastly, I'd just like to say that it was really amazing having you on the inaugural discussion here today. I think we spoke about this previously. You mentioned how important it is for scientists and researchers to speak with members of the public. And for that very reason, I'd like to announce that India Science Festival has launched the second version of the festival as the India Science Month online for everyone to enjoy an online science festival at home. We request you all to kindly go to our website and have a look at what all we are offering. It's going to be held across the month of January 2021, and we plan to get scientists and researchers from all over the world to come and speak to the general audience. So that brings us to the end of this webinar.
I've always believed that science is sterile if it doesn't serve a social purpose. So thank you very
Right.
much for connecting science to society through this channel.
Thank you so much for coming on our show here today, sir. It was really lovely. That brings us to the end. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.